Hello, I'm Joe Furia, Executive Director of World Forestry Center, and welcome to the fourth episode of Adapting to the Era of Megafires, a community and expert summit on catastrophic wildfire in Oregon and beyond. In today's episode, our co-hosts will talk with experts on how Oregon became a national leader in responding effectively and safely to wildfire, and discuss what challenges and opportunities still remain. With no further ado, we present Episode 4, Protecting Firefighters, Responding Safely and Effectively to Wildfire.
There's a tradition in forestry of fighting fire because the tradition is one of protecting the forest. The fuels begin to accumulate, the composition of the forest began to change.
My neighbor knocked on my door very aggressively and said, "Shirley, get out here." And I said, "What's going on, Karen?" And she said, "Santa Rosa is burning down." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. We got into the helicopter and the winds were blowing 40 to 50 miles an hour. There was smoke and fire everywhere. All I could do was look and say to Mike Thompson, our congressman who had been in Vietnam, "It looks like a war went on down there. It looks like a bomb." And he kept turning to me and saying, "Yeah, that's what it looks like, but it's actually worse." Hard to talk about still. Those first few days were so hard. We didn't sleep much. We worked all the time.
I was calling my mom and saying, "I think it's all gone. I think it's all gone, but I don't know." I didn't sleep for probably 3 or 4 days, and we didn't find out for about 4 days that our house was actually gone. The Mackenzie River is home for me. It's been home for my partner for his entire life. I can't reimagine my life anywhere but here.
I want to get to my kid. Oh my God, look at that.
Being a homeless teacher teaching homeless students is really an impossible situation to be in.
It's hard because, my mom lost her stuff for work. My dad lost all his equipment for work. So right now, it's been a big blessing to have people give us clothes, give us blankets, give us towels, things that we need to keep going. Even if it's the smallest thing, the smallest help right now is the biggest help to us.
Well, welcome back, everyone. And I'd like to take a moment to welcome back my co-host, Katrina Holland. Hello, Katrina.
Hello.
And also my co-host, Charles Wilhoite. Welcome, Charles.
Good to see you, man.
The three of us have served the last 2 years on the Wildfire Council, and we are today with episode 4 of the Wildfire Summit series. And I'd like just to take a moment to reiterate the three key messages of the summit. Number one is that wildfire is indeed growing worse. The data show this. We feel this. The science is very clear on this. And the three main contributors to these wildfires are actually growing worse. Fuel loads are continuing to grow. Climate change continuing to make its impacts, and also population growth, particularly inside the WUI. So the outlook is very serious, and it's most serious for our most vulnerable communities, creating very significant social justice issues. So that's the first message. The second message is all is not lost. We do have means at our disposal. We do have a strategy. We're going to be talking about that here today in episode 4. And the third message is that we do have a strategy, but we don't really yet have an implementation plan. We need to really step up at the state, federal, local level, nonprofits, academics, private sector. It's going to take the power of public-private partnership to step up and really implement the strategy that's been laid out. So stepping back to that strategy, the best practices that we look to are contained within the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy that was produced back in 2014. It benefited from decades of research, best practices from around the globe. And it establishes three main targets. First one is to create fire-adapted communities. The second one is to create fire-resilient landscapes. And the third is to safely and effectively respond to wildfire. So in episode 2, we addressed fire-adapted communities. In episode 3, we addressed resilient landscapes. And here today, we're going to address safe and effective response. Safe and effective response, what we really mean by that is firefighting and being effective as we tackle wildfire, because in this era of heightened megafires, firefighting is more dangerous, and we need to put the tools in the hands of our professionals. We need to provide adequate resources in order to keep them safe and effective. So with that, I would like to again say thank you to Charles and Katrina for joining me here today. We had a chance to look at the clip that really addressed the issue of suppression and firefighting. And just curious, Charles, what's your reaction as you kind of think about firefighting in the context of this challenge that we face?
Well, I had the inside information of having a spouse whose brother is a firefighter, and he has for years volunteered in fighting fires. And when you see a fire that is out of control, in his words, when you hear the roar of a fire, it's unlike anything else you've ever heard, because it's totally out of control. It's totally a natural act, and it's something that you can't manage at certain times. And when I watch those clips, that's the sense you get. It became an issue where people realize we can't manage this, and then all of a sudden, you're reacting in the most extreme circumstances. You're bringing in firefighters from other states. You're trying to manage and coordinate the activity of a lot of people who are, bottom line, risking their lives for others. So we need to do everything we can to both prevent the severity of fires and also manage the people in a way that keeps them safe. So that requires intervention, it requires planning, it requires strategy, but at the end of the day, we have to have a process and a plan that protects the people while they're trying to protect the property and other people around them. So it's scary when you see something like that. And it's even more scary when it comes personal in the sense of a relative or someone you know who has walked into that setting voluntarily. And we have a responsibility to do everything we can to protect them.
Yeah. Katrina, what's your reaction?
Yeah, well, like Charles, I have family who wanted to be a firefighter. And just recently, actually, we experienced the last day of one of our staff members who, to him, it's his dream, but he's going to be fighting wildfires, and in particular here in Oregon. I'm grateful. I feel a sense of gratitude when I see how intense and incredible it is. I mean, I think what the woman said on the video is so true. It looks like a war zone. And I can't help but feel a sense of, like I said, gratitude, but also worry. Like, what are we doing to protect our folks on the front lines? What are we doing to protect people and property? What are we doing to ensure that we can stop putting the folks that we love, who are voluntarily putting themselves in harm's way? What are we doing to prevent from putting them in spaces where it's just too much, and unfortunately it could potentially take their life?
Yeah, I have. It's interesting. We all have family connections. My family back east extensively firefighters throughout the family, and so there's a deep personal connection there. And I also have the benefit of having a lot of friends here in Oregon and across the West that work out in the forests, many of whom are firefighters. And even if they're not full-time firefighters, they're foresters and other professionals who are drawn upon. And so one of the features of our firefighting system is that we draw upon folks that are doing other things. And so when these fires attack, it's all hands on deck, and the communities rise up, and they come and do what's needed. And so lots and lots of friends and connections in the firefighting community, and you hear the stories, and they're just harrowing. And what's fascinating is just how much they downplay that. It's just, there's a sense of duty, and there's a sense of stepping up to do what's needed. And so in a lot of ways, they don't really they don't really tell the stories about just how what the conditions are like, because to them this is just what's needed, and they step up and do what's needed. The other aspect of this that's interesting to me is that it's somewhat a paradox in that you hear of the three major contributors to these megafires. Fire suppression is one of them. 100 years of suppressing fire is a big part of what got us here. And so it's somewhat counterintuitive to say, well, then why would you need to increase fire suppression and increase firefighting when that's part of what got us here? And what you find as you kind of dig into that is that actually it's not only one of the three priorities in the National Cohesive Strategy, it's the top priority in the cohesive strategy, because in this era of megafires, these fires are so much more dangerous. They blow up so much more quickly. The fuel conditions, the humidity, the winds, and so forth, that these fires are truly deadly. And we need to step up and give the firefighters the resources that they need. And we now have all these people, we have all these structures, we have all these communities. There's a lot of values that need to get protected. And we don't want wildfire across the entire landscape. We want more fire, but in certain areas, and so in certain zones, if you will. And so there's areas where we want more fire, and then there's other areas that need to get protected. And these include our forests, our farms, and obviously our communities. So it's not like we can just flip the switch and suddenly go to no firefighting. It's just the opposite. We actually have to step up and protect those values with increased firefighting where appropriate. So I'm just kind of curious, Katrina, what's your reaction to that as you kind of think about how do we thread this needle where we increase more wildfire on the landscape where it's appropriate, but in other areas, we need to actually be more targeted and invest more in fire suppression?
Well, as you were talking, I have to be honest and say, in thinking about some of the information that we've learned through this summit, with the increased fuel and denser forests and more uniform landscapes, my big question is, can we? How do we prevent some of these intentional fires from becoming bigger than what we want them to be? But assuming that we do have the resources, and that we are directing time and resources and tools in the ways that we need to and we can, we got to do what we got to do, because it's really important to prevent some of the things that we've experienced in this increased era of megafires. As a housing person who jumped into this space of wildfire, the first thing that I thought was, well, what am I doing here? But at the same time, I was like, oh no, this actually makes a lot of sense, because if we're not doing all we can, and bringing all of the resources to bear and the knowledge that we have to bear in these conversations, it may be difficult to get the resources and the time and the tools that we need. And so it just makes me want to sound the alarm and just say, hey, everybody across all industry, pay attention to this. This affects you too.
Yeah.
Let it happen. Ask for the resources, push for the resources, because the housing justice realm that we're hoping to achieve, where tenants are having a first right of refusal, where housing is a human right and people can get off the street more easily than it is today. All that stuff is affected by wildfires, because if it gets burned down or if they're in a danger zone, we're not really improving their conditions. So that's what I think about.
Yeah, Charles, it really, just building on what Katrina was saying there, it just seems that if a big part of our mission here is to protect our most vulnerable communities, just you have to, the importance of initial attack is so great. You need to really get on those fires, because once they grow out of control, then the impacts to our communities are that much greater. The dangers, not just to the firefighters, but to the community. Just interested to your action on that as well.
Sure. And I think, I can't recall which one, but our two of our three experts, maybe all of them, address this directly, and it speaks directly, Matt, to the need for a very strategic and focused plan. And the point they raised is it is not a one size fits all circumstance. If you're looking at the southwestern part of Oregon or central Oregon or drier, arid areas, you have a different plan for fire treatments and fire suppression and control than you do in the northwest parts of the state or our wet forests. So we have to be strategic in how we approach it. And in that strategic approach, we know that populations are different in different areas of the state. We know that indigenous and native populations are in different parts of the state, and they historically have dealt with fire in their own way. The native populations were used to fires, and fires managed and were a part of the ecological system. So our plan has to consider all of those component parts. And at the end of the day, that particular strategy should be focused to the specific area with consideration of the inhabitants and population of that area, and also very focused on native populations, indigenous populations, people of color, those who are economically challenged. So it's a complex, needless to say, it's a complex problem. But we can address it because we do have the science and we do know what happens in different parts of our state, and we can therefore determine which approaches and treatments are appropriate. And one of the key points is some fire is good. So when we're looking at wilderness areas that are not heavily populated, let's manage that, but let's let it take its natural course. And then we look at more populated areas, we have to take different suppression type approaches. So strategic approach, once again, we have the science, we can take the steps. It just requires commitment, as Katrina indicated, and execution.
Yeah, I think that the concept of being strategic and integrated and holistic is exactly spot on. I mean, one of the things that we'll hear about from our panelists is the importance of integrating fuel management with fire suppression. So to the extent we can manage fuels, get the fuel loads down, it creates a safer firefighting environment. And so one of the great tools of managing fuel loads is fire, prescribed fire, and manage wildfire. And so it's somewhat surprising that it's entirely consistent to want more fire on the landscape and increase your investments in fire suppression. And not only is that possible, it's actually necessary in order to be effective and safe with wildfire response. We have to be providing more fire on the landscape, prescribe fire, manage wildfire to create the safe environment. So the real strategy, as Charles was indicating, integrated, so that you are making these investments, you are modernizing our firefighting force at the same time that you're building resilient landscapes and building integrated fire adapted communities. So with that, I think that's a great setup, and look forward to bringing our panelists on board. So thank you both. Well, thank you, and welcome back to my co-hosts, Katrina Holland and Charles Wilhoite. And thank you as well for joining us, our four panelists. So I'd like to say thank you to Representative Lily Morgan from Grants Pass. Thank you to State Fire Marshal Mariana Ruiz-Temple. Thank you to Deputy Chief Fire Marshal Travis Medema. And thank you to Chief of Fire Protection from the Oregon Department of Forestry, Doug Grafe. So I'm going to start with Mariana. And again, welcome, Mariana, and just ask you if you just take a moment to kind of reflect. We just came off of this historic fire season, the Labor Day fires, but this is not an isolated incident. We've seen decades of increasing fire activity. You've had a very rich career here in Oregon. And just maybe, where are we in a moment of time, and you look back on your career and you kind of see where things are going?
Yeah, thank you for that question, and thank you for having us on this this panel for this important conversation. I think, I was reflecting certainly after the 2020 fire season, but more so over the last month. And, when we look across at least the Oregon Fire Mutual Aid System and what our Oregon Fire Service, Structural Fire Service, has responded to, we've really seen an uptick in the last, I would say, 8 or 9 years, since 2013. But when you look globally, the amount of fires we've responded to in Oregon in terms of what we call conflagration, which are fires that affect communities, we've seen bigger fires, we've seen longer fires, and we've seen more fires. And so that uptick certainly explains, when we're talking about the amount of resources and the needs, that the amount of capacity, the amount of firefighters are not keeping up with the pace of the fires that we're seeing, and how those affect our firefighters in terms of smoke and exposure and risk. But we're certainly starting to see the effects of that. And I would say since 2013, we've started to see those grow even more.
Yeah, thanks. That might be a good opportunity for Doug Grafe at the Oregon Department of Forestry to talk as well about just the impact to the firefighters. I mean, you and Mariana and Travis, together really leading firefighting teams. When you think back to 2020 fire season, but maybe a little bit longer term, and what we're asking of our firefighters, you look at the overtime hours and fatigue and just the magnitude of these fires. Maybe you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Matt. Certainly, the world has changed for us. In our history in Oregon's wildfire in the past several decades, we can think of big fire seasons in 1986 in Southwest. Folks who are around at that time will remember that as a big year. 2001 and 2. Every decade, it seems like there's a big fire year. Since 2013, and in fact, since 2012, with the beginning of the drought conditions in Oregon, it's been very consistent. Significant large fire seasons in the state of Oregon every year. And we're also fighting more fires outside of what we typically think of fire season in the springtime, and even at times over the winter. We just had 200 acres on fire this past weekend, late in March, and evacuations of 182 homes outside of Bend in late March. And this changing dynamic is certainly putting more strain on what we think of as wildland firefighters coming in for fire season, when we're asking to sustain that effort with more complexity throughout the fire season, and then carry that effort throughout the year. Relative to the nation, when we bring in firefighters across the country during our fire season, we want to reciprocate, and we're sending more and more firefighters out in December and November and January to California to support when they came up to Oregon to support us. So definitely a increased strain on wildland firefighters across the country and of course across Oregon.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to turn now to Representative Morgan. We asked Representative Morgan to join us because you're coming to us here from Grants Pass, Southern Oregon, in many ways, kind of ground zero of the wildfire issue here in Oregon, an area of, a lot of activity, a lot of risk, a lot of impact to communities. So we've heard from the firefighting community about, the intensity of the challenge these days, the growth of wildfire, but at the same time, we have to protect these communities. We have to protect the resources, and so there's a heightened challenge for us to actually get in there and protect these communities. Maybe you could speak to that challenge and what the real impacts have been to your community.
Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and the opportunity to bring light to how this is affecting our communities. Josephine County has existed longer than Oregon has been a state. And so it's one of those things that we have lived in the woods, lived in the integration of our forests for a long time. But as the density increases, as more people are living here, and the fires seem to be changing and becoming more increasing. When I was a kid, we had a couple fires that affected school for a week. Then later there was the Biscuit Fire, and that impacted a substantial amount of resources and people with 500 plus thousand acres burning. But just in the last few years, it's become an every summer issue in fire season, and so the impact with working with ODF and our local fire agencies, but more significantly in Josephine County was in 2017 with the Chetco fire that started between us and the coast. I remember about a month into it, they said, "Well, we're watching it," and we said, "Don't watch that fire, put it out." And they said, "Well, there's reasons. It's okay. It's not going anywhere. We're going to keep a handle on it." Well, then it did go somewhere, and it almost burned out the coast. Those communities were on evacuation. Whole towns of Brookings for over a month. I had residents in the Illinois Valley that were on evacuation. And then the next summer, we had so many more fires with. It was in July 15th, I think it was, that all the lightning struck, and fires everywhere, and they just couldn't get to all of them. And so we ended up with the Garner complex and the Klondike fire and the Taylor Creek and all these areas where I had a couple thousand homes evacuated for a significant amount of time. And that's not to say the smoke that impacted us for 2 to 3 months. My little car has burn marks on the top of it still from hot ash in certain areas and just was hailing down ash constantly. We were able to get uh, it was a very big partnership between our local fire agencies and the state during those conflagrations, and then the federal agencies working alongside with Oregon Department of Forestry to try to save as many homes and keep homes safe. That Labor Day, we had another fire that went to a conflagration over Labor Day weekend. And interestingly, our mutual aid partners in the Rogue Valley fire districts, they had all been on fires all day long when we had all of a sudden over 100-foot wall of flame, and we lost a couple homes. Well, a couple months later was when the Paradise fires happened, and it really struck all of us, and that could happen to any of us. Uh, we did not anticipate the 2020 session. And while my neighboring communities lost well over 2,500 homes in the Alameda fire and the Aubertine fire, at the tail end of that, as all my firefighters in my community were over there helping, then the Slater fire came up over from California and was evacuating and affecting homes in my region as well. And the partnership that we saw to try to save homes and save people was incredible. We literally had Forest Service and ODF on structural trucks coming alongside to put 18 miles of dozer line in between homes in the forest. And it was just an incredible effort of people working beyond any energy imaginable. After working all day over there and coming back and have to defend, um, it really showed me how we do not have enough personnel and the time it takes because we live so far away from everybody to get help. And everybody, neighbors and professionals alike, were out trying to save homes. And it was a very incredible thing. And unfortunately, it affected the whole state last year, as you know. And so we're all now looking at how do we do this different? How do we make an impact to save lives? We lost lives in that 2020. How do we save lives? How do we save homes? And how do we be intentional moving forward?
Turn also now to Travis Medema with the State Fire Marshal's office. Travis brings a very interesting perspective, long career with the Oregon Department of Forestry, just recently transitioned to the State Fire Marshal's office. His dad was a career professional with the Oregon Department of Forestry. Travis grew up around this issue. You've got a very long, rich perspective as you've seen wildfire activity here in the state evolve. Maybe you can kind of reflect on some of your history, your family's history, and some of the more impactful memories that you have.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Honored to be here. And, I'd echo what my colleagues have said that are on this panel. And as I think about, the evolution of change, really, in my mind, over my almost 30-year career, it really has been the impact to Oregonians. And I think back to, when I first started, and, I started as a wildland firefighter right out of high school. And, things are different now than they were then. I remember responding to fires that, a large fire was a couple thousand acres. And, you were done with that fire in 7 to 10 days. And, now I look to the 2020 season. I think about other large megafires in Oregon that have been on. And, things have significantly changed. And that evolution of change really, I think, is exemplified by the 2020 fire season. And that really is the impact to Oregonians. Fires aren't out in the middle of the woods anymore, small that you can put out. Things have changed, and those have really impacted our communities. And so as we think to the future of wildfire in Oregon, I get pretty excited about, the cohesive strategy, the national cohesive strategy, and really a holistic approach to how Oregonians and Oregon is going to deal with fire, and really working across all three of the key components of the cohesive strategy. So the first is we definitely need to have a safe and effective response. And I think the chief, along with Representative Morgan, highlighted that. Additional capacity is needed. Fires are way more complex, longer duration. Fire seasons are longer and more capacity is needed. We have to work in and around homes and communities and prepare them for wildfire. And then lastly, we have to be proactive and, work outside of communities and do fuels projects and restoration and make sure that that landscape is prepared for fire. We know fires now, run into communities, and we've got to work across all three of those key legs if we're going to change the dial as we look out 20, 30 years in Oregon.
So, Doug, one of the things we were talking about as we were preparing here today is this paradox that, if you look back at what the big causes are of these megafires, one of them is the vigilance on our suppression activities, and how for 100 years we've been putting out fires, and in doing so we've allowed these fuels to build up and create this unnatural conditions. And so one might conclude from that we should stop suppressing fire, or at least cut back, significantly. And that's actually not the recommendation from the cohesive strategy. The cohesive strategy says that we do need to have more fire in the landscape, but at the same time, we need to really address firefighting safely, effectively. And actually, it's the number one priority of the three priorities that are established in the cohesive strategy. So maybe you could help us make sense of that.
Yeah, I'll give this a shot. I think it's a really critically important topic to understand, and that is fire response really needs to be on a continuum. For ODF protection, our responsibilities, about 16 million acres of landscape, in and around where people live. About 4.5 million acres is in the wildland urban interface. The remainder of our protection is high value private timberland and grazing lands. Fires on this the landscape that we protect, aggressive initial attack is critically important to mitigate that immediate risk to life and property. And our mission is very clear. And I actually really appreciate that mission. It's straightforward. There's not a complexity to it. And the legislature has supported the department with resources to be effective in that arena. On the other side of the spectrum, however, as you look at the rest of the landscape in Oregon, let's think about Crater Lake, for example. Every year, lightning fires start in Crater Lake. And the federal agencies have a different policy framework in which to respond to fire. They have a choice to either aggressive initial attack or allow that fire for resource benefits and do the job that fire does on the landscape. Because we all know fire is a natural part of this landscape. And every year we see fires up in the high Cascades, 5,000, 10,000 acres that move across the landscape at ground level, not a lot of impact to Oregonians. And that's a beneficial fire, reducing fuel loads. So those annual fires that roll in at the high Cascades, those beneficial fires, that's important to have those because we don't want that turning into the next catastrophic fire. The way you do that is let natural fire do its job of thinning out the forest, taking out the understory vegetation. As we move closer to jurisdiction under Oregon Department of Forestry, we have to be proactive and mechanically go in there and do the work that natural fire does in and around our communities. And that's the fuel treatments and mechanical thinnings that we see. So it's important to have that full range of opportunity and response across Oregon's complete landscape. The challenging part I think of is when I consider that ground in between the top of the crest of the Cascade and where ODF has its protection in and around our communities. And that's much of what the Forest Service has jurisdictional responsibility. And that's where the tough decisions are, where they're given space to say, is this going to be a resource benefit fire or are we going full suppression? And it's a risk decision and choice in that space. And the way we mitigate that risk is to ensure that we have room to do that work ahead of time. The understory thinning and treatments of prescribed burning on the ground to avoid those fires that they're trying to achieve resource benefit values from turning into catastrophic fire. And that's the tough decision space that I think we collectively have to understand. And I want that all the landscape outside of ODF protection to be successful. I don't want to see catastrophic wildfire coming onto ODF protected lands. And the way to do that is have that active management, have resource benefit fires when it makes sense, not in August when the winds can blow and it can push down into our communities, but where it can do good work on the shoulder seasons. So it's a difficult decision to make, and we need to be, those tools all need to be on the table, and we need to understand that decision space is on the landscape and what risks there are that comes with that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the very first question that you asked at the opening of this episode, which is what comes to mind with management. And I think Doug just touched on it, which is how do you weigh the risks and benefits of management fire that could easily turn catastrophic in a space that is heavily populated. I have to go back to what I said right in the beginning, which is I feel immense gratitude for the folks making these decisions to try to prevent catastrophic wildfires. And I really, truly hope that, our elected leaders will hear this and give the tools and resources necessary to continue making these decisions, because somebody's got to do it. I know I can't. So thank you.
And I was going to go immediately to where Katrina is right now, to Mariana, Doug, and Travis, to extend a sincere thanks. I know you often hear the word hero attached to your name, and I know that word gets thrown around a lot, but when you approach your role and your responsibility in the selfless way that you do in protection of others and their property, that truly is heroic. So thank you very much for your service. And Mariana, I assume you didn't have a lot to do, so you stepped into the top job in the middle of fire season, and boy, that had to be pretty darn challenging. So I would pose a question to you, Mariana, having heard what Representative Morgan talked about as far as when we address the fire and how we balance that point that Katrina just made of protection versus preservation and security of people. You have a representative you have a person in Representative Morgan who has experienced it personally. She's lived through it. She has that perspective. What do you say in your role to her and others in her position in response to her comments? And what's your top three list? This is what we definitely need, or we're going to face more trouble and bigger problems going forward. Can you respond to that for me?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know Representative Morgan in a former role as a commissioner. And the reason I know that is because we have worked on fire when she was a commissioner in her area. I think when I look at what has happened to Oregon, and we all went through this together, at least on the west side, Southern Oregon, Central Oregon, Eastern Oregon, this is something that they've lived with. And so I think one of the most important things for communities is how do we help the entire community understand the effects of fire? How do we help the entire community understand that the firefighters, the fire, whether you're wildland or structural, generally where these fires are happening are in communities that are either volunteer fire districts or already under capacity. And so when we see those fires impact places like, Mackenzie Bridge and Detroit, you're calling on a small number of forces that will not keep pace with these types of fires that we're seeing on the landscape. And so when the bell rings and our firefighters come in, our first and foremost priority is to protect people. And that will be our first and foremost priority. And so we balance, the response with what work the community has done and what we can do to help preserve property. And our priority will always be people and the safety of our firefighters. And I think the work that needs to be done off season, I think, and I'm not sure that we have an off season anymore in Oregon. California was where we were about 20 years ago, having the luxury of this conversation. But we don't have to wait 20 years to implement, increased capacity of our response systems, modernization of our response systems, and also understanding how to live with fire. All of those, really speak to the national cohesive strategy. We look at that framework and we invest now in those systems. We're hoping for and planning for a more resilient Oregon, whether that's in people, our systems and technology, and our response structures.
So I've got a question for Travis, and maybe kind of focus in a little bit on the 2020 fire season. It was so impactful, and I would say, for that matter, any of our firefighters. But I hear, so Doug, Travis, Mariana. But you think specifically about this, this historic event, and you think about, the specific situation that emerged with the Riverside fire approaching the Beachy Creek fire, and you've got firefighters that are positioned between these two mega fires. You've got high wind conditions. You've got landowners, communities that are expecting, protection. You got your folks in there doing their thing, but you're in real time watching a potentially, catastrophic, truly catastrophic event. Maybe you can kind of talk to us about what happened there, and how you address that, and how the folks in the field were experiencing that.
Thanks, Matt. Those days, the Labor Day fires, those conditions that set up really set kind of the state on a trajectory and pathway for explosive fire growth. And, we saw that, we witnessed that, and really led to, some pretty bad outcomes. And so as you think about how to coordinate efforts, and again, fires were from the border, the northern border of Oregon to the southern border of Oregon. You really at the statewide level are managing large geographic areas. And, clearly number one was additional resources. So as you think about that much fire on the landscape of Oregon, how to have the adequate resources that you need to manage those fires. And so there's an immense amount of coordination that occurs both at the state level and with our federal counterparts. With that, there's a lot of technology that comes into play as we're looking at incidents and we're, thinking and talking through weather conditions and where incidents may move towards and to. And that coordination is through, National Weather Service. We have people that are part of our incident management teams that are specific to incident meteorologists. So they're on the ground taking observations and monitoring the fire behavior. And so as, those conditions set up, we're getting intelligence from experts, both from a meteorology perspective, but also a fire behavior perspective. And so, as fire managers are making decisions, a lot of those decisions, are based off of, again, what is happening with the weather, what the fuels are doing, and then what the folks are experiencing on the ground. So the firefighters actually out there setting up those fires. And as incident management teams are in place, and we had dozens of them in Oregon, they're feeding that information to those teams and they're making decisions. I'd go back, to the chief's point, and, ultimately our priority number one mission is people. And so, we're going to try and save and protect as many people as possible. There are challenges, and you can't protect every single person when you don't have enough resources in every single home. And so it sets you up into decision making around how to prioritize limited resources and, how to manage that risk.
Matt, if I could ask Representative Morgan a question, and we really appreciate your service to the state as well. And you have lived through fire. You've seen it firsthand. You've experienced it. How do you and your role and with your counterparts emphasize the significance of it and motivate investment at the level that's suggested right now as far as how we treat our forests and protect people and property?
Well, that's a great question. And honestly, it's one that I've been speaking on for the last 4 years. How do we uh, do the maintenance on the land? How do we have fire resiliency in our communities? And do it in an incentivizing way that we can bring old homes up to a hardening factor? How do we um, allow the interaction of living in the most beautiful place while knowing we're going to live with fire risk? And so, how do we find that balance? But unfortunately, because of the extensiveness of the 2020 fires, and honestly, when I was just listening to Travis speak, I didn't realize, but 2 years ago, I had a Labor Day fire in my community. And then the 2020 fires are again the Labor Day fires. So that's a significant thing to look at the time of year when these things are happening and focus on when can we do the fuels thinning, when can we do the maintenance. But the 2020 season allowed for everybody in Oregon to see what we're facing. So it's no longer has to just be me in Southern Oregon saying, please help us do something differently. Please don't let these fires just burn when they're going to turn into mega fires. Let's do the maintenance we have to in the off season, but put the fires out in the fire season. And I have colleagues like Pam Marsh in Ashland and Jeff Golden, senator from Ashland as well. They lost so many in their community, both homes and lives, that they are leading the charge in the state for saying we have to do something different. And it can't be an all or nothing. It can't be only one way. We have to look at the full spectrum of how to face this and look at all ways of keeping our communities safe. At the same time, there's a reason people lived in these communities in the first place, and the beauty that is here, the natural scenery. And so finding again the balance of how do we approach this, and I think everybody's listening.
That's a good question, Representative Morgan. One of the things that's been swirling around in my head as we've been going through this summit is, having participated in the Wildfire Council, I remember the sticker shock that I felt in seeing that huge number. And I can only imagine some of our elected officials who are having to face really tough decisions on where to put their money, where to invest their dollars. Do you feel a sense of urgency from your colleagues that hopefully we can make some investments, even in the budget deficits that we may be facing in the future, to sort of to make sure that we're avoiding the sticker shock of being reactive as opposed to proactive?
That's a great question. And the urgency I experience as being part of the House Committee on Wildfire Recovery is definitely listening. We spent over 15 hours just taking testimony from citizens on the impacts in their community and how to help. And so we are finding ways to help those communities recover and get back on their feet. The Senate side has a bigger, broader aspect, and I know they have a bill coming through to find help. The governor has said it's one of her top 4 priorities this session is to deal with the wildfire recovery. And so I believe the time is now, at such a time as this, to take seriously what's going on and to come up with solutions that we really can move forward. The answer isn't telling everybody to move out of the wildland urban interface. That won't fly in my community. So, how do we actually engage those that are living here and say, how do we get the most out of where we are? That we are going to live with fire. So, how do we do it safely? And how do we keep the fires from turning into these mega fires? Because traditionally you would replant, you would see those soils not just go to muddy waters, you would find something to do. Well, right now it's burning at such high intensity that it's sterilizing the ground. And it's going to be generations before there's any life there other than the ground shrub that again burns again. Every fire season as a commissioner, I heard, well, this isn't normal behavior. Well, this isn't what normally happens. We have to define the new normal. And I think 2020 saw that. And we're going to address as much as we can this year. Yes.
I'm going to put the firefighters on the spot here for a sec. One of the benefits we had on the Wildfire Council was Mark Labhart was on the council, and he brought a very long experience with firefighting specifically. And he told lots of stories about situations where we knew exactly what needed to be done. We know the importance of initial attack. You've got to get the fire suppressed within before it reaches 10 acres. And yet we just simply didn't have the resources available to us. Because in this era where there's so many fires on so many landscapes, and so here you are, a firefighter, you're a professional, you know what needs to be done, and you just don't have the resources. I wonder if you could share any specific stories like that and what the consequences were for not having those resources, and what might have what could have been done versus what actually happened.
In 2012, when drought conditions first landed in Oregon, and our eyes opened really wide about what potential was coming our way, where we burned approximately 1.2 million acres in Oregon that year, which was one of the highest acres burned we've seen in our history. A lot of that happened in the range, and subsequent from 2012, the legislature invested in rangeland protective associations. The landowners in the range all collaborated and coordinated. We've added close to 15 rangeland protective associations and now have protection across all of that landscape. And that's an example where I remain hopeful. Yes, we have dramatic challenges ahead of us on the fire landscape. But together, landowners, legislature, our communities, all working together with eyes wide open on the challenge we have. We can get punched in the gut with the 1.2 million acres now burned and the majority in that range country. And being resilient as Oregonians, investing in systems that have proved to be effective, buy-in from all landowners across that landscape. We have a model protection system in the range now that other states are looking at to understand how we can preserve critical sage habitat, preserve the way of life in the range, safely respond to fires. There's examples of that across Oregon. So I'm going to remain hopeful, but we absolutely have our work ahead of us, similar to what we did from 2012 forward across the rest of the state.
As Travis indicated earlier, the evolution of fire and things that we're seeing different that we might not have seen in the 90s or the early mid 2000s. In the last 5 years in Oregon, we've seen significant fires in our croplands, in our the areas that typically would not be a conflagration. And asking ourselves, and that speaks to the need for further collaboration, further capacity and coordination, in increasing increasing protection in those areas. Those are what in the fire service we would call underprotected in terms of fire districts, but in that vast area, having the right tools and the tools quickly for those types of fires are important. I think about the Western United States. When we talk about capacity, there's times when our fire service mobilizes very quickly to California, October, November, December. But when I look back at the last 8 or 9 years when we need resources, they're experiencing similar issues and similar concerns. So when we talk about capacity, many times it is just what we have here in Oregon. We don't have necessarily the luxury to bring them in a very quick manner. And so when we look at the Office of State Fire Marshal and how do we improve preparedness and communications, we rely on the fire service to be our response mechanisms, but increasing technology and modernization is key to our response systems. We're looking at how technology might help in either pre-positioning resources, using technology that Travis talked about with weather and information on the ground, using a common operating picture that helps make decisions quicker and faster, and mobilizing those resources, those scarce resources, sooner. That's key in that initial attack phase that keeps fires small, and how we work with Oregon Department of Forestry and our response partners earlier to help those fires stay small, and also working with the communities so that when those do happen, that they're prepared, especially in the areas where we don't have capacity. One thing I just want to mention here too is when we look at Oregon and the Oregon Fire Mutual Aid System, that is made up of our 305 fire departments, 13,000 Oregon firefighters, 11,000 of those are volunteers. So that really is the group of folks that we have that are responding to protect Oregonians. And when we also look at where wildland urban interface areas are, 92% of Oregonians live within a fire department. So when you take a look at the amount of the public in those areas, the amount of our firefighters that we have, and certainly the amount of fires in the areas where we have lower capacity, investments in people, investments in technology, all point towards a more prepared and safe response. And again, people always being our primary goal is the safety of our people, and then how do we keep our firefighters safe as well.
I think that there's been, over the decades, if you look at the staffing levels at some of the state agencies, you'll see that Oregon Department of Forestry used to have incredibly more resources in their staffing. And those staffing models, no matter what division they were in, when it came to fires, it was all hands on deck. Everybody took a role. Well, it's harder and harder to fill all those positions. The funding has gone away in those roles as well throughout the years. And so it's one of those things that there's not as many to draw upon. And then, yes, the structural departments are having to do a lot. And I can't speak enough about State Fire Marshal Mariana Ruiz-Temple, in our Slater fire last year, all her teams were deployed. She pulled together an impromptu team to send to us to help save homes in our area, which is thinking outside of the box. It's meeting the need where we're at, and we need more of that direction. But there's a direct correlation to when ODF had their highest staffing levels, there was harvest going on state forest lands that brought resources to pay for those personnel. As we've been more mindful of the environmental concerns and those harvests have gone down, the resources are not there either. And so it's pulling more from state other budgets to have to come up with these resources. And that's had an impact on why we're seeing such a demand right now from the state budgets.
Maybe just add a couple points. One, I think that's important is that, Oregon is a part of all the rest of the other states, and we operate in a national system. And so the national system, allocates resources and moves those resources. And the chief, outlined when the West is busy across all the 17 Western states, those resources aren't available to come to Oregon. And so when we think about that and we think about, capacity that we bring in for these large megafires, that takes time. And when you're talking about significant megafires, time is always working against you in that, when you need resources, and those are some really key critical resources, whether it's additional structural engines to protect communities and additional firefighters, whether it's aviation resources that can be absolutely critical in protecting our communities, those take time and get allocated across the nation. And so as we think towards the future and we think of what wildfire looks like in 20, 30 years in Oregon, having that capacity and those investments now to deal with not only our current problem, but our future problem will be extremely important. And as we think about that added capacity, I think what really is highlighted for me out of the 2020 wildfire season are those downstream effects to all Oregonians, whether that's smoke impacts, whether that's water quality impacts. I think all Oregonians were impacted by the 2020 wildfire season. Thousands upon 10,000s upon hundreds of thousands of people were in some level of evacuation at some point during the 2020 wildfire season. And, the impacts that has to the citizens of Oregon. And so, my perspective, Matt, is that, investments now in the capacity that my colleagues talked about, not only one brings us to kind of modern times and the new reality, as the representative said, of wildfire, but also has to position us into the future. I don't think if you look at my colleagues that are on here that have been in this business for a long time, we don't see this problem going away anytime soon. And so it's critical that we make investments now so that we can protect the citizens of Oregon.
I think what's important for us, for all of us, is that fire is different than it used to be. And what that means is we have to look at fire differently. We have to understand that it affects different people in different ways. And so when I take a look at, how this affects me personally as a person, as, the fire service, it is important that we put the lens that there is, whether it's smoke or actual response, it affects all people in different ways. And are we as a culture prepared to ensure that we're meeting people where they're at, whether that's in prevention, whether that is information, and whether that's in response. It is not lost on any one of us in this room here that Oregon suffered significant loss, right? That drives and demands a lot of us as a society. Oregon lost over 4,200 homes. Souls were lost, and I think that demands the need for us to improve our technology, our response, and ensuring that all Oregonians are not left behind when it comes to all of the components of prevention. Fire is a 12-month system now, and I think that when I was growing up, I would think of wildfire. I would definitely think it was in Southern Oregon. Maybe 15 years, 20 years ago, that's where I spent the most of my time. But 2020 fire season, we saw border to border, 12 counties within 24 hours. There was not a system for prevention or I think a mind frame for any of us to be prepared for what that meant for us. But I think what this is showing us is that's where we need to go. And I'm very thankful that we have this group helping us get there, and legislators and leaders like Representative Morgan who've lived it and been there, and certainly my counterparts here who felt it. We had firefighters responding that were losing their homes. We had people that were helping save people and helping with communications, and it was an all Oregon response system, all hands on deck. And I think that demands all of us to look for ways to improve the safety of our people and visitors to Oregon.
As I look at my career and history in Oregon, as I think about that, and I think about what faces the state in the future 20, 30 years, a holistic approach has to be the pathway that we take. We can't respond our way out of the current problem that we have. We can't just do fuels treatments and that be adequate. We can't just protect communities. We have to approach it from a holistic perspective. And that holistic perspective is the ability to respond. So when our communities are threatened, when citizens are threatened, we can protect them. We have to do work within our communities. I look down to Southern Oregon and the Alameda fire. That wasn't necessarily a normal conflagration act. That was an urban conflagration. So that was home to home ignition. And so we have to think about our communities, and we have to think about, 20, 30 years, and what are we doing? How are we preparing? How are we working with our local communities to be prepared for wildfire? And then lastly, we have to do fuels treatments, and we have to get out and manage the landscape. And without investments, strategic thinking, like from the governor's office and this wildfire council, we're not going to change that dial. And if we don't change that dial, I believe, over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to see more fires, just like we did in 2020. We're going to have significantly more Oregonians impacted. And as you think about that impact, it's hard to measure at times, but we know, and studies have shown, that the true cost of wildfire, is significantly more than just the suppression. We look at the health impacts that wildfire has from smoke. We look at our landscapes as Oregonians disappearing and being lost for generations. And so as I boil it all down, and I've thought many sleepless nights about this, it's got to be a holistic approach that involves Oregonians and really looks at those three different legs of the national cohesive strategy and anchors into them. And then the last piece is we have to have a long-term view and perspective on this. Again, this is not a problem that I believe we can solve tomorrow. I think we need to have a long-term approach as we work across all three of those aspects. But here and now, to deal with the threat and the risks that Oregon faces, investments in that suppression response and working in communities is critical. And then long term, starting now, we need to begin working on the fuel situation in Oregon.
I think it's important to recognize that we've got a solid foundation in Oregon to work from. And it's 100 years of evolution with dealing with wildfire on the landscape. And there's one premise that has been consistent throughout our history, and that's a recognition that all landowners have a right role and responsibility to engage in preventing and responding to wildfire in this state. And that's a fundamental principle that you don't find across the West, this shared responsibility. And what that equates to at the end of the day is a really powerful partnership with Oregonians and the state in preparing ourselves for fire. Because of that fundamental relationship, it's not Oregonians pay a fee and then the state provides fire protection services, and the citizenry, the landowners, the range land uppers get out of the way. It's a partnership to prevent and respond to fires, because there's a shared responsibility there. And that's really powerful when we experience years like 2020, when all contracted resources are deployed across the nation. And in Oregon, we can bring to bear 450 pieces of heavy equipment from local landowners, poised and ready when those winds died down, that we can take the offensive and start digging those containment lines around these fires. That was because of this principle in Oregon that says this is a shared responsibility for fire protection, where landowners have a right, role, and responsibility to engage in fire on the landscape. That's amazingly powerful and brings great fruit to bear in years like that. The other point I would make relative to that principle is ODF, we train local resources. We have about 650 local resource bosses trained up in basic fire protection. These are landowners that I can call on above and beyond what we have at staff, what we have at local fire service, across State Fire Marshal or ODF. The citizenry has stepped up to say, we're going to be part of this solution with this responsibility. You're not going to find that in any other state. And it's incredible in those tough years to see that once the contracted community across the nation is fully deployed, we still have resources in our tank available to us in Oregon. And that's because of that fundamental partnership that exists. So I think that's really proud, something for Oregon to be proud of, and has shown to be highly effective. And then I would close, Matt, with just echoing my peers in the fire world here, Mariana and Travis, really echo the reality that large fires and more complex fires are on the landscape now and into the future. And the state really needs to prepare for this. And I would send a shout out to all parties who engage in the Governor's Wildfire Council because you've given us a roadmap. We're not walking into this conversation blind. We have a pathway before us. It's not easy, but it clearly follows a national cohesive strategy that's proven to work. We need adequate response. We need fire adapted communities, and we need resilient landscapes. And we have a pathway before us to get there. And I'm hopeful that we're going to move forward collectively to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Well, I know we're talking about fire suppression today, but I can't help but think about all the things in all of our lives that are affected because of what happened in 2020. We still have people that are out of homes. We still have people that cannot find the resources to rebuild their employment. They've had to leave the area. We have schools and universities affected. This is not something that we're going to just turn around overnight and be back to where we are. This is having a long-term impact on all of Oregon. I also know that there's something to Oregonians, that we are resilient. We are strong. We are courageous and coming alongside and compassionate for each other. And I hope that's what comes out of this as a whole, is that we remember that whether you live in my district in Southwest Oregon, or you live in Eastern Oregon, or you live in the metro area in Portland, that we all care about the whole state and the people that live here. And if we can continue to be ready for fire, then we're going to be ready for those severe storms that come as well, those winter storms that come, those other events that affect all of our lives. And we need to continue to lead the way. And we have that opportunity because of these fires to challenge all of it, to get our communication so that if there's an evacuation, we know that everybody was notified in time. We know that there's a means of getting to those people to get them out. Or what we saw in Medford with that wall of firefighters that were told to get out, and they stood there and they pushed back those flames and protected that neighborhood, or whichever story after story we can come up with, that right now is the time for us to come up with the solutions and lead the way in the next decade or so, so that we can recover soon or prevent this from happening again.
And once again, thank you for your unwavering dedication and commitment and service, and appreciate you spending time with us today and sharing your perspectives, which, as I will say again and again, are very well informed. And that's what we need to have at the table so we can come up with a strategic plan that works for the state.
I just wanted to also express an immense sense of gratitude to all the folks who are on the call today. I can't thank you enough for what the sacrifices that you make each and every single day, both in preparation for this and in response for when wildfires come. We're eternally grateful.
And I guess I would also say before we wrap up here, I'll start with Representative Morgan. I just want to say thank you so much for your leadership. And Wildfire Council is populated by citizens. We're folks that are impacted by wildfire. We stepped up. We're volunteering here to try to to try to do something to confront this challenge. And we really depend on thought partners, and we really depend on the state leadership and legislature to work with us. And you have just been absolutely fantastic all the way throughout, including today. So I just want to say thank you so much for your leadership. I mean that very sincerely. And for our firefighters, I would say on behalf of the council and behalf on Oregon, thank you for all you do. I mean, the jobs that you guys have taken on are really unimaginable, even to somebody like me who has a kind of a background in this. When I confront what you guys are doing, it is so moving. It is so inspiring. I never come away from a meeting or an interaction with firefighters without feeling inspired. You guys are a really, really special breed. And I don't know that you know just how special you are, because you guys, just kind of operate together. But when you interact with your community, it is truly, truly inspiring. And so thank you for all you do. I don't know that you get enough thanks. Katrina, I'm just going to turn it over to you. What are some of your reflections, given what you've heard here today, and as well as, given everything else we've learned?
This is not an easy issue. That's my immediate reflection. I am, like you, I'm incredibly inspired by the sacrifices and the work that our firefighting teams, not just necessarily the front end folks, but the folks that are doing a lot of the planning in the background, as well. I'm incredibly inspired and thankful for all the work that they're doing. And I can't imagine the immense pressure that they're feeling with folks like us who are just so desperate for reprieve and so desperate for relief and not experiencing what we did in 2020. I also feel for Representative Morgan, who both personally has experience with this and professionally probably feels that same immense pressure. For those of us who live in urban areas that may not necessarily come into contact regularly with wildland conditions, I can't imagine what it must be like to have to share that story over and over and over again, and how traumatic it may be. So I'm just thankful for her leadership in trying to push that forward, and working with her colleagues to do the same so that we can all experience a better quality of life. I also experience a sense of hope. And thinking about my participation in the Wildfire Council, I remember seeing the faces across the tables and hearing the passion behind folks' voices and their desire to truly address this and have innovative conversations and talk about things openly and honestly, even to the point in some instances where we weren't necessarily getting along, but it needed to happen, right? And I'm inspired by that, and I feel a lot of hope that maybe this is something we can that we can get under control to help achieve all of the goals that we have in addressing the social ills that we deal with in our state, with housing, with racial justice, with environmental justice, with access to resources, economic justice. This touches so many different things, and so I feel a sense of hope that maybe we can see some forward movement and progress on this in the next several years.
And I will just share, Matt, of course, first, seconding, and thirding Katrina's comments. It's very interesting when you hear from the front line fire professionals. They put themselves at risk every day, as Katrina stated, and they do it without hesitation. And the one thing that I picked up from all of their comments is, first and foremost on their list of priorities is people. There was no hesitation. It's about taking care of and protecting and saving people. But what I also picked up is there was a consistent theme that we need to understand fire and the role that fire plays in our ecosystem. But that having been said, you have to balance between fire and letting the ecosystem take its course and then protection. And it's a fine line, as we heard in some of the comments from our speakers. But when you think about fire and the role it plays, their theme was consistent in that we have to manage the forests. And I think that's what we're really talking about here. It's a strategic management, and it's a strategic management from the perspective of recognizing we need to first understand fire, understand the role it plays, how it impacts different areas, and then be positioned to address fire with the appropriate response.
Yeah.
Everyone was consistent in the fact that fire potential has increased significantly over the last several decades. Fuel sources have increased significantly over the last several decades. Yes, we want to manage it, but if we understand it, we know fire is going to happen. We have to try to take steps to make it happen in a way that's manageable. And when it's not manageable, we have to be positioned with capacity, i.e., people to fight fires who are trained and qualified, and resources, and most notably, technology. I love the comment, I believe, from Chief Ruiz-Temple, who talked about strategically implementing technology to know where to place resources so that we could be more responsive to fire. And of course, there was also the discussion about prescribed fire or controlled burns, taking steps to make sure the forest was in a position to be resilient with human interaction. So I love the comments. I love their perspective. And once again, Representative Morgan wrapped it all up by saying, I've lived through this. People are first, but we have to position ourselves to address this growing risk. And I think her comments just hit the nail on the head. She understands the circumstance because she's lived through it. And she knows we need our parties positioned with a strategic plan and ready to be collaborative and cooperative so we can take care of people and property in our environment.
Yeah, I think that's all well said. And I think one of the things that we, that we talked about and continue to talk about in the Wildfire Council is the impact to our most vulnerable communities, and how our most vulnerable communities are our most disproportionately affected. And what's the most obvious way that you protect your vulnerable communities by initial attack and stopping these mega fires before they get out of hand? And so this is a very, very critical piece to protecting all of our communities, but particularly our most vulnerable community. I'll tell you another thing that just take away from me is it's one thing to study reports. It's you see the data, you see the charts, and so forth. And it's all showing that these fires are getting worse and worse and worse. It's another thing to hear from these firefighters themselves who are saying, listen, I've been doing this for decades and something has changed. This is not, the same that we had, 20, 30 years ago. And that was very, very consistently coming through. And these are not salesmen. These are very duty-bound, professional firefighters who, if anything, are very soft-spoken and understated. Are coming and saying, let me just tell you, this is very, very different. And so I think that came through. I also was very struck by the fact that they all saw the need for holistic solutions. It wasn't just like, hey, put us ahead of everybody else. They saw themselves as being part of a greater whole, and were advocating for this holistic solution. A couple other things that I would just echo. When I first, really started diving into this issue and going out and talking to people around the state, one of the things that I heard, and Doug Grafe spoke to this, is the fact that Oregon in many, many ways is a leader. I mean, this is not like we're dealing with a broken system. This is a system that is the envy of many other states. And it starts with this partnership and this sense of shared responsibility, shared community, and landowners looking after one another and so forth. And this partnership. And in many ways, people are saying, whatever you do, don't break this, because this is actually work and we need more resources, but don't stop this. And in many ways, I think if we didn't have this partnership today with the various state, federal, local, private, all these volunteers, if we didn't have that and we had a clean slate, I think we'd want to invent this. And I think we would probably say, boy, we couldn't invent it to be as effective as it is today. And this is a very, very effective and passionate community. And what they really lack is resources. They need additional resources in order to modernize. There's tremendous new technology that we're not bringing to bear. Representative Morgan spoke to the fact that we've had disinvestment at the Department of Forestry, some of it going back to the global financial crisis where we just slashed budgets at ODF and we've never caught back up. And so we've got more firefighting with fewer firefighters than we did before, and that obviously doesn't make sense. So anyway, I think it was a great conversation, and again, I'm very struck just by how much they see themselves as a part of a larger solution, and not just one individual, and not emphasizing that they're the sole solution, but part of a larger solution. Any final comments or before we kind of wrap up here?
I think based on the dedication that you just emphasized, we can't do enough to protect our firefighters and facilitate, their ability to deliver the service. And that, I think, is a bottom line issue. Protect and serve. We have to support that at the highest level.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I say thank you to my co-hosts, and it's been another very, very important and conversation. And so thank you. As we look ahead to episode 5, I just want to reiterate that really our reflection here is that wildfire is here. It's the elements that are driving megafires are growing worse, and so this is a situation that needs to be addressed. That the impacts are most felt by our most vulnerable communities, and so this is this is a significant existential challenge here for Western states like Oregon. The second message is that again there is a solution, and we've worked hard building upon a tremendous body of work. We have got a very detailed strategy. And then the third message is that we have a strategy, but we don't yet quite have an implementation plan on that strategy that needs dedicated resources, dedicated leadership, funding, obviously. And so on that last piece, that will be the topic of episode 5. We've gone through defining the problem, episodes 2 through 4. We've talked about the solution. And now what lies ahead is talking about how do we implement, how do we step up and meet this challenge at the scale that it demands. So look very much forward, Katrina and Charles, to seeing you on episode 5, which I think is going to be a very, very interesting
great conversation.
Awesome.
That concludes our 4th episode. Next week, our co-hosts will be joined by leaders at the state and federal level to discuss what gaps still remain between the actions on the ground and adapting to the era of megafires. If you enjoyed our program today, please invite your friends, family, and colleagues to join us and learn more about wildfire. The future of our forests and our communities depends on it.